What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you a video on early access, specifically on Steam, as a sort of discussion-oriented video, because 2024 has been a pretty, I would say, lively year for early access releases, many of which have been fairly positive, which isn't always the case, as other games, like, for instance, the recent Unforetold Witchstone, never make it out of early access. And seeing as my channel reviews and covers games pretty much every day, I've played and messed around with a great many early access titles, and while I generally will not review them until they've fully launched into 1.0, I will, however, make videos about them covering what they're about, showing off features, addressing any problems, the usual stuff. Mostly because I just love playing video games, but also a little bit because, especially with early access titles, I think it's important to essentially document what people are buying and what they are inherently getting themselves into when they purchase one, because while the overall concept of early access is a bit risky from the perspective of whether or not this game actually ever releases, for someone like myself that risk is basically zero, because if I purchase a game, I'm almost certainly going to make my money back from it off the videos I make about it, not to mention that since this is my full-time job, that's also a tax write-off for me. When I buy a game, even an early access title, it's not exactly the same as when anybody else does, meaning that I'm simply in a position to evaluate what these are and inform people so they can hopefully avoid any associated risks. But in spite of that, what early access is supposed to be about is giving people access to a work-in-progress game at a typically reduced cost in an effort to incorporate player feedback and hopefully make the game better overall, which is a very fancy way of saying that the game is unfinished and they'd like to involve the community in making it better. And while there are many such cases of this working out exceptionally well, with the practice basically establishing both a community as well as offering smaller devs a pretty extensive round of QA, essentially, that they otherwise simply wouldn't be able to afford. And on the player side, if you love the game and it works out, you've essentially paid much less for a title than you would have otherwise, and potentially had a pretty good experience along the way. But there's a lot of pitfalls to early access, and like anything, there's a fair bit of nuance to the conversation to be had around it, since it is wonderful when it works, but there's plenty of times that it simply does not. So I'd like to go over just a few of the pitfalls you might run into with early access titles. Right away, sometimes the game just never gets released. This can be for a whole host of reasons, usually because the studio folded, perhaps they simply abandoned the project, which also happens. Like I mentioned earlier, Unforetold Witchstone is never going to release in full, though technically it's just been put on hold indefinitely, and they even pulled it from the Steam store, which was the right move in that case. But then there's other games like Superfuse, which are very much so still being sold on Steam, and yet for all intents and purposes seem to be dead in the water, with updates and information being far from forthright in what appears to be some sort of issue behind the scenes that no one is allowed to talk about, because according to everyone who will say anything, the game is coming but they don't have any news to share. And that might very well be true. That game might actually be very much so being worked on, and it might eventually see the light of day. But reality is it's been in early access for quite some time with zero updates, and it's not looking good. And a big reason that that is a risk is that the situation in terms of getting your money back is pretty likely to not go your way, because that still just falls under Steam's normal refund policy. So even Unforetold Witchstone, if you have that downloaded right now because you bought it and you've played it outside of Steam's refund policy, that is to say more than 2 hours basically, they are unlikely to grant you a refund on this game that is almost certainly not coming out and has even been pulled from their store, but you're still not getting your money back for it, despite this happening like a month after it went into early access to begin with. And while I can't be certain, it looks like that might be the case because they put the game into early access hoping for cash, and it didn't do as well as they might have wanted, and thus they couldn't continue. Which means oftentimes games that release into early access because they need that money are especially risky, because if they don't get that money, that project is likely dead in the water, and the people who did pay for it are basically out of luck. And while those are pretty rough situations all by themselves, that's also not the only risk, really. Early access isn't a guarantee of improved quality over time. It's not a guarantee of you enjoying the experience, frankly. Because while early access games are inherently unfinished, the work it takes to finish those games might not necessarily be the things you wanted out of that title, or they might simply not address other problems the game might have. Some games just at large aren't really conducive to, I think, early access, period. Then there's the conversation about how much do you show in early access versus what gets tested by players, and how all of that factors into the actual launch of the game. There's a lot of ambiguity around that, but to talk a little more specifically about some of it, what you show in early access and what gets tested is, in my opinion, very important, because the more you can show players and the more they can offer you feedback on, the better that is likely to be in the long run. But even then, that doesn't necessarily mean it will completely work out. So take Baldur's Gate 3. It spent a long time in early access, but only the first act. And you can even find videos of me saying that I bet that the rest of the game essentially isn't going to be nearly as polished as Act 1, because that is a very common thing to happen with games as a whole, but especially CRPGs, where that last act is exceptionally complicated. And Larian themselves wasn't new to this. They did the exact same thing with Original Sin 2, and its last act was very buggy, just like Baldur's Gate 3's was. So what you show in early access has a direct effect on what you can actually improve, because there's really no substitute for an extreme amount of people playing your game and nitpicking it. But the reverse of that can also be a problem, because let's say you put the entire game in early access and now you can see and test the entire game, sure, but it might very well sort of bite into the excitement of it for its actual launch, especially if the game is, for instance, a very narrative-heavy game and you kind of already know how the story ends. Then the launch version of that, while maybe a certainly smoother experience, doesn't necessarily equate to excitement for that release, which might very well lead to lower sales if enough people aren't talking about it. So all of those various things mentioned, early access is an extremely risky proposition for mostly the people buying into early access. Now, that's not to say all of the risk is on the side of the consumer. Some of it is on the side of the developer, to be sure, because if they put a game out into early access, there are certainly people who are simply going to see that as the release of that game, and if their work in progress fails to meet expectations, it might very well receive a pretty negative reception overall, which can itself be a difficult thing to overcome, which is one of the many reasons that putting a game into early access purely to try to get money to continue development continues to be a bad idea. Now, in spite of everything we've just talked about, there are plenty of times early access works out quite well. Many such cases where its time in early access, if anything, was to its great benefit, as we saw with, as I mentioned, Baldur's Gate 3. While Act 3 might not have been as polished as one would have liked on launch, the part that was in early access, that saw major revisions and overhauls over the course of its almost 3-year period in early access, was a real treat for people to get to, and because that is such a big game, most people were so impressed with the opening that it took them a while to get to the end where the problems were, if they saw them at all or even cared. But it's really those revisions that I want to focus on. While there's plenty of risk to be had with early access, it can be done extremely well, and that's typically when the developers of said title incorporate player feedback into the design of the game. They change things, they iterate upon them, using early access as the sort of springboard for exactly that activity to refine the experience that they're trying to build. And you take a game where that has been done, that process has sort of been followed and iterated upon, etc., and compare it to a big blockbuster release that never had anything like that, and you might very well see issues that could have been avoided if they had done some sort of early access. And given just that simple fact, and the success of more prominent titles in early access these days, I think bigger releases are coming around to the idea of doing that, because when done well, you can engage with a community, build up hype for your game, while at the same time making that game that much better. So when things go well, people have effectively provided feedback, which allowed the developer to improve things like performance, bugs, maybe even iterations on entire systems and numbers and how they work individually with each other, how the game is balanced even. while the player got to be involved in that process, potentially for something they really enjoy at likely a reduced cost, though not always, and it can certainly be a good thing for everybody involved. So speaking for myself at least, I think when developers use early access for basically what it was intended for, that is to say engaging with players and that community to make a game better, with a clear plan in place to do exactly that, and managing to do so without putting themselves at risk of simply folding as a company or abandoning a project altogether, then there is a lot of potential for early access to lead to very, very good games. And we've seen that many times over. Which is why, speaking for myself at the very least, early access is a perfectly acceptable route to working on and later releasing a game. And the practice by itself isn't as frustrating to me as it certainly can be for others, as long as people are aware of the risks they're taking on when they purchase an early access title. And because those risks exist, I mostly want to stress with every early access game that I touch or cover, which are many, specifically for this reason, what people are actually getting, what that looks like, what some of the pitfalls are. Is this a game they would even enjoy in its current state? Because I would say the biggest thing when it comes to early access titles is understand that you are paying for what the game is now, not what you think it could be in your head if everything goes well. Because it might very well never transform into that thing. That might not be what the developer's vision of what that game even is. So broad strokes, look at the whole picture of an early access title, what that game is right now, the price they are asking for that experience, what that experience looks like from a performance standpoint, etc. And then decide for yourself if it is worth the inherent risk that comes with paying for it, because you might very well never see that money again, even if that game never gets released and gets pulled from the store. Because if that current sort of value proposition for every early access title you look at is not something you are comfortable with, then it's definitely not something you should be participating in. And I think the best thing to do in those situations is simply wait for the 1.0 release if there ever is one. But all of that is how I feel, at least, about early access titles, which is pretty much what I've got for this video, but I would certainly love to hear what everybody else has to say about it, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.